In 1943, the U.S. Navy achieved something that seemed impossible at the time. We turned the tide of the Atlantic. German U-boats, which had been bleeding Allied shipping dry, suddenly faced a new threat: degaussing technology that could render ships invisible to magnetic torpedoes. It was a triumph of wartime engineering, desperately needed, officially celebrated. But there's a ship that doesn't appear in those triumph stories: the USS Eldridge, a destroyer escort, commissioned in 1943, assigned to the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. And according to some who were there, it became part of an experiment that went so catastrophically wrong, the Navy has spent 80 years pretending it never happened. What if that's not the full story?
Carlos Allende knew he shouldn't have been watching. He was aboard the SS Andrew Furuseth, a merchant vessel, anchored in Philadelphia that October afternoon. What he saw, he later described in letters that would haunt researchers for decades. The USS Eldridge, surrounded by unusual equipment, massive generators, cables running in configurations that didn't match standard naval procedure. Then the air changed. According to Allende, who used the name Carl Allen in some accounts, the destroyer began to glow, not like fire, like the air itself was bending around the hull. He described it as a greenish fog, pulsing, growing denser until the ship's outline started to blur. And then it wasn't there anymore. The ship reappeared in Norfolk, Allende wrote years later, 200 miles away. Minutes later, it was back in Philadelphia. But the crew? He never finished that sentence in writing, but in conversations with researchers, he added details. Men fused into the metal bulkheads. Sailors who came back translucent, fading in and out of visibility. Crew members who went insane, who couldn't stop screaming about what they'd seen during those missing minutes. A former Philadelphia Naval Yard worker, who only identified himself as Thomas in a recorded interview from the 70s, corroborated strange activity around the Eldridge. Unusual security protocols, scientists who weren't Navy personnel, equipment being loaded at night that he'd never seen on any other vessel. We were told it was classified magnetization research, Thomas said, but the way they cleared us out, that wasn't standard. And the crew that came off that ship after the tests, they didn't look right. They looked scared.
The official record is remarkably clean. Too clean. The USS Eldridge's deck logs for October 1943 show routine convoy escort duties, no experimental procedures, no unusual incidents. The ship's entire service history reads like a bureaucratic template: commissioned, deployed, decommissioned, sold for scrap to Greece. But here's what doesn't fit. In 1994, a researcher filed a Freedom of Information Act request for all documents related to degaussing experiments conducted in Philadelphia between 1943 and 1945. The Office of Naval Research responded with a single-page letter stating that, quote, "no records of such experiments exist." Not that the experiments didn't happen, that the records don't exist. That's a different answer. Declassified documents from Project Rainbow, officially a radar and visibility program, contain references to unforeseen complications and personnel difficulties that led to the project's termination. But the specifics? Redacted. Entire pages of technical reports blacked out, not for national security reasons, but marked privacy concerns. Privacy concerns? For a military experiment from 1943? Former Navy personnel who served in Philadelphia during that period have a strange habit of going silent when the Eldridge is mentioned. Not hostile, just careful. One veteran, interviewed for a documentary, simply said, Some ships, you remember their names. Others, you're told to forget. When pressed, he ended the interview. The ship's crew roster presents another problem. Standard naval records track every sailor assigned to a vessel. The Eldridge's roster has gaps. Men listed as assigned in September 1943 who don't appear in October records. No transfers logged, no deaths recorded. They're just gone from the paperwork. And then there's the matter of the scientists. Naval intelligence files reference civilian scientists attached to the Philadelphia Shipyard in 1943, working under Office of Naval Research oversight. But their names? Missing. Their research? Classified under categories that still haven't been declassified 80 years later. Categories that use terminology, temporal displacement, field coherence failure, that wouldn't become common physics language until decades after the war. It's not proof, but it's enough to get under your skin.
There's a photograph that circulated in conspiracy circles for years before vanishing from most archives. It shows the deck of a naval vessel, taken from an elevated angle. The image quality is poor, grainy, typical of 1940s military photography, but there's something wrong with the metal. The bulkhead shows warping that doesn't match combat damage or standard corrosion. The steel appears melted, but not from heat, more like it was pulled, stretched from the inside. And in one section, barely visible, what looks like a human handprint, embedded, not on the surface, in the metal itself. The photo was labeled as coming from a decommissioned destroyer, 1943. No ship name, no photographer credit. It appeared in declassified Navy archives, then disappeared. For almost a decade, the reference number led to a removed file notice. Researchers who visited the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard before its closure in 1995 reported strange scorch patterns on certain dock sections. Not fire damage. The concrete showed discoloration in perfect circles, overlapping as if something had burned from underneath. The patterns were concentrated in one area, the berth where the Eldridge was documented as docked during October 1943. Those dock sections were removed during demolition. The concrete was crushed and buried rather than recycled, which struck demolition workers as unusual given the Navy's standard procedures for salvaging materials. Norfolk Naval Station has its own anomaly. A maintenance log from late October 1943 records emergency repairs to dock equipment, describing unexplained electromagnetic damage to several cranes and electrical systems. The log entry notes that damage occurred following brief presence of unscheduled vessel. The vessel isn't named. The log entry was stamped classified and remained so until 2001, when it surfaced in a batch of routine declassification. Why classify a dock maintenance report? Sailors who served on ships that berthed near the Eldridge reported equipment malfunctions, compasses that spun uselessly, radio equipment that picked up strange frequencies. One electronics technician interviewed in the 1980s described hearing voices on emergency channels that sounded wrong, like recordings played backwards or speech stretched across time. It happened when that ship was near, he said. You could feel it before you could measure it. The air felt charged, like right before lightning strikes. And then there are the medical records. Veteran hospital admissions from late 1943 show a cluster of sailors treated for severe disorientation, burns that didn't respond to conventional treatment, and psychological trauma officially attributed to combat stress. But these weren't combat veterans. They were crew from escort vessels, ships that never saw direct action. Their symptoms matched reports from later nuclear testing accidents, radiation exposure, electromagnetic field damage. But the atomic bomb hadn't been tested yet. The technology didn't officially exist. What were they exposed to? The simplest explanation is the one the Navy offered decades later. The Philadelphia experiment never happened. It's a myth born from misunderstood degaussing procedures, embellished by imaginative sailors, turned into legend by conspiracy theorists. But that explanation requires ignoring the gaps. The more strategic theory suggests something did happen, but it was conventional, a failed attempt at radar invisibility using electromagnetic field generation. The Navy was desperate in 1943. German technology was advancing faster than expected. Experimental weapons programs were rushed. Corners were cut. Safety protocols ignored. Maybe the Eldridge was a test platform for technology that didn't work. Maybe crew members were injured by electromagnetic exposure the Navy didn't fully understand yet. Maybe the whole thing was buried because it represented a costly failure during a time when every resource mattered. That would explain the missing records, the classified reports, the scattered medical admissions. It wouldn't explain the testimony about disappearance and translocation. But testimony can be unreliable, especially decades after the fact. Then there's the darker possibility. For those who remember Operation Paperclip, when Nazi scientists were quietly integrated into US research programs, the timeline is suggestive. Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, Einstein's unified field theory work, experimental physics that pushed against the boundaries of what matter and energy could do. What if the Philadelphia experiment succeeded, not at making ships invisible to radar, at something far more destabilizing? What if they accidentally tore a hole in the fabric of space-time itself? What if the Eldridge didn't just disappear from Philadelphia? It slipped sideways through dimensions we don't have names for. The crew's reported symptoms match theoretical predictions for what would happen to biological matter exposed to extreme gravitational distortion or temporal displacement. Molecular structures breaking down, atoms phasing in and out of alignment with normal space-time. The human body isn't designed to exist in two places simultaneously. And if it worked once, even catastrophically, the implications are incomprehensible. Because you can't uninvent that knowledge. You can't pretend you didn't see what happens when you push physics past its breaking point. The Manhattan Project at least produced a weapon with understood parameters. But a technology that could move matter through dimensions, that could affect time itself? That's not a weapon. That's a door you can't close. Some researchers point to the abrupt halt of certain Navy experimental programs in late 1943. Projects that were well-funded, promising, suddenly terminated with no public explanation. Money redirected to conventional programs. Scientists reassigned or quietly retired. Not because the experiments failed, but because they succeeded in ways that terrified everyone involved. History usually doesn't forget triumph. It forgets failure, and it buries the things that shouldn't have worked, but did.
82 years later, the silence is what speaks loudest. It's not about what's documented. It's about what's missing. The gaps in service records, the blacked-out technical reports, the photographs that disappeared from archives, the witnesses who went quiet. Men who served on the Eldridge and survived the war rarely attended reunions. Those who did wouldn't discuss the ship. Not with hostility, just refusal. A door closed and locked from the inside. One former crew member, approached by researchers in the 1990s, simply said, "I was there for 3 months. I I remember 2. Then he ended the conversation. That's not the response of someone protecting classified information. That's the response of someone who experienced something that broke their understanding of reality and never recovered. The Navy's official position hasn't changed. The Philadelphia experiment is fiction. But they've never explained why routine degaussing procedures would require 80 years of classification, or why dock maintenance logs needed to be sealed, or why a destroyer escort with an unremarkable service record generates Freedom of Information Act requests that return no records exist. What happened in Philadelphia that October wasn't recorded in victory speeches or history textbooks. It wasn't celebrated. It was buried, quietly, thoroughly, by people who understood that some knowledge is too dangerous to acknowledge. And maybe that's why certain research never continued. Not because we couldn't, but because we were told not to. The technology exists now, theoretically. Quantum mechanics has caught up to what might have been stumbled upon in 1943. We can manipulate fields, bend space-time in controlled laboratory conditions, make particles appear in 2 places at once. But we do it carefully, with protocols, with ethics committees and international oversight. Because somewhere in the institutional memory of military research, there's a warning that doesn't need to be written down. We tried this once. It went wrong in ways we still don't fully understand. And the cost was measured in human beings who came back changed or didn't come back at all. The Eldridge was sold to Greece, renamed, served in their Navy until 1992, then scrapped. The metal was melted down, recycled, dispersed into new ships, new structures. The physical evidence literally dissolved. But the questions remained.
3 months ago, a Reddit user posted what they claimed was their grandfather's diary from 1943. He'd been a naval engineer stationed in Philadelphia. Most entries were mundane: duty schedules, weather observations, complaints about rations. But there was one entry from late October. It described unusual activity around a destroyer, scientists arriving at night, the dock area cleared without explanation. And then simply, something happened. We were told not to discuss it, ever. The post gained traction. Historians requested to examine the diary. The user agreed, said they'd provide photographs. Then the account was deleted. The diary hasn't surfaced since. Was it real? Was it another fabrication in a long line of Philadelphia experiment hoaxes? Or was it someone finally trying to tell a truth that's been suppressed for 8 decades before being silenced again? The question remains open. And maybe that's exactly how some people want it.